I do. I have it on.
Your viewership went down, I told you. So I wasn't in it. People were probably demanding for me in the comments, my following.
So either I break fervor.
Did you bring a burrito to eat today?
No, I wish. Actually, I actually have a salad burrito, but I'm not gonna eat it here. Just because I want to look good for the camera. Although this could be like a mukbang channel. It's just like zoom in on me. Just like slowly opening like my food in the camera, crunching it like really loudly.
Move it a little bit further up, maybe.
I'm just like eating it in the camera, very slowly, you know, like tapping on the packaging. They're like licking the fingers. Like
One of my favorites. You're welcome. Still with us, I think.
Yeah, surgery's not for a week and a half.
no.
When's your surgery?
The 5th or 6th.
I'm so sorry. Did you fall on the ice or what happened?
I broke it September.
Are you serious?
Your boyfriend?
No.
No.
Oh, I was like, that's a story. That's the tease. It's gonna go viral. Yeah.
I broke it hiking in May. And then I re-broke it in September.
Oh my
Playing with
god.
my dogs. So,
My sister
so
just
sorry.
had surgery on her
it sucked really bad because she won
Hardcore.
You can always just move this, guys. This is like.
Yeah, but
She had
to
to
get
get
CBD.
the plate removed. She got in March last year. It was like that icy on the pavement.
Yes.
She slipped on the ice, caught the pavement, and twisted, and
Oh
broke
my
her
God.
calf all the way around.
Oh my
And she got
gosh.
rushed into emergency surgery and this and that. And,
That's scary.
That's really horrible.
Holy
and
cow.
she's like the
Potatoes.
only athletic child we have in the family.
And you're like,
And
no.
she's so depressed.
Since we're on the topic of broken leg, let me throw this in before I forget it, because I never remember this. But Epictetus, when he was a slave, his master was mad at him and was twisting his leg. And Epictetus looked at him and he says, if you keep doing that, it's going to break.
Good.
And he kept doing it and it broke.
That's because he didn't care.
And Epictetus looked at him and said, I told you it would break.
I told you so.
Yeah, well, that's
So,
kind of
like,
literally
that's-
like what happened.
That's how a stoic reacts to that kind of.
Well, yeah,
Ow.
so I broke it in May
Think of the
hiking, and then I
least of
did
this.
yoga class after, 2 yoga classes afterwards, so I like just kept stretching it even though it was broken. And the doctor, like, he's a surgeon, he's literally an orthopedic surgeon. He's like, yeah, I knew it wasn't gonna heal. This is in September after I broke it in May. Because I had to wear this boot for 6 weeks over the summer, and graduation too, which really sucked.
Oh.
And so every picture, I'm like, oh my god. And so he was like, oh yeah, back in the summer when you broke it, I totally knew it wasn't gonna heal. I was like, are you kidding me? All summer my ankle was hurting and I didn't know why. And then I twisted it in September watching dogs and playing with them. And I went in again, he was like, yeah, I totally knew this was gonna. Are you kidding me? He's like, yeah, let's do an MRI and look at it. I was like, you think? Duh. And he's like, yeah, it's actually really fucked up. This is like 2 weeks after the MRI. And he was like, yeah, you're having surgery. When do you want to schedule that? I'm like, it's the middle of the semester, never. I want to schedule that, like, never. And so he was like, well, you need it, or you're going to wear that brace for, like, ever until you do schedule it. And I'm like, I'm supposed to be on crutches, but just don't feel it right now.
My sister was supposed to keep her splint on because it's only been like a week since she got surgery. She took it off and put her boot back on. She's like, I'm not wearing that dumb thing. And, yeah.
No, I literally am going to be wearing this boot until my birthday in February. Because they're going to put a cast on after surgery. And then I can't even, like, I have to actually use the crutches because I won't be able to put my foot down at all. And so I'll be graduating December 16th. And they're like, yeah, you're crutching for graduation. I'm like, that's going to be 3 graduations.
Could be
now.
crutching for Jesus.
You're graduating in December.
Yeah, for my associates. I
New
didn't get the credits
crusade.
in time, so I was
Crusade.
7 short for my degree this summer.
Really?
I could
Totally.
have taken summer
That's
classes
totally
for
wrong.
my
Would have been
11th year.
expensive though.
Well, yeah,
So,
and I didn't really
hey, voila, there's where I read that. Actually.
Yeah.
Right?
Socrates was separated from are alike in the coherence between their
Just let it
creations. One of the
I'm
few,
going
and
to.
certainly
Yeah.
best
I don't want to deal
known.
with this anymore. more. I've
if
literally
not
been dealing with this
substantiated,
all
how would you
summer.
substantiate that? Of episodes we have from Epictetus' life occurred when he was still a slave, in a fit of rage, of Vigus
Well, that's
rage.
like kind of what happened with my
His
ankle. I
master
didn't really
began
wear
to
the
twist
brace
his
the
leg.
whole
In a
6
calm
months of the
voice,
slave.
the slave
And then, like, I
warned
trashed
him
it
that
all
the leg
summer
would
and
break.
then hurt it
The
again.
master,
So
ignoring the
there's a
warning,
piece of
broke
bone with the
Epictetus'
cartilage
leg,
ripped out
prompting
of
the maimed
joint. I don't know
man
how that
to
even
declare
happened, but it
in
literally
an
pulled the
even
bone off.
voice,
And
which
then there's
is
the
the
bone that
stoic
broke
part
off
of
in the
this.
first place that they just
Did I
left
not tell you
this
it would
summer.
break?
And then there's a crack from when I
So
broke
that's
it
kind
6
of-
years ago that's
so
not
he was a
good
lame-
either. And
He's
then I
lame
tore
the
the
rest.
ligament and then stretched the other way. So they're sewing, literally, I'm gonna have like 5 scars on my ankle because 3 of them are where they're fixing the joint and the cartilage because they have to scrape it out and drill 3 holes in it. And so that's where those 3 are. And then to sew tendons back together and ligaments and all that, they have to slice it open because they have to have it all the way apart to stitch. So I'm like, my ankle is gonna be so ugly. It's gonna be like really nasty. And I'm doing it right before Thanksgiving and my mom invited like every relative we have over. I'm
Oh
like,
my God.
I'm literally gonna be so high. I'm gonna be sitting in the chair and they're gonna be talking to me and I'm probably gonna be like drooling or something really gross. And yeah, she's like, it'll be fun. I'm like, I hate all these people. Why did you invite them? She invited all my grandparents and this old lady that always comes. She's nice, but she like doesn't stop talking like about
You like
everything.
surgery presents.
So I always
Yeah,
wanted
you need some
to
good
get
luck.
somebody to find out that you're
So here's,
life.
this is where I
Yeah,
get it.
because whenever I watch on television, you're always pretending to be so dumb. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not pretending. I really am dumb. Yeah, I am. You know, and what's more, I'm proud of it.
Now watch, watch.
You're proud of being dumb.
I mean, now, did you ever stop and think, who are all the people that cause all the trouble in the world?
I give up who?
The smart people.
Smart people.
That's right. And who are the scientists and the statesmen and the generals who run all the government, make all the wars, and the dumb people? No, the smart people. That's right. And another question. Look at air pollution. I mean, who invented the cars and the machines that cause all that?
You're smart
The
people.
smart people.
Yes.
Yes. And what's the major problem confronting our universities and the
Smart people. See, I never thought of that.
That's because you don't like me.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, and then there's the overpopulation crisis.
Well, now you just wait a minute and hold on there, Goldie. You can't blame that on the smart people. I mean, dumb people have just as many babies.
Yeah, but they can't count.
I know that. But what can we dumb people do about this
Well,
thing?
now, this is the question we all have to stick together.
Yeah.
I've said that before,
Yeah.
didn't I?
Tell me when I heard it. Go ahead.
In fact, we just formed a national organization.
Organization?
Yes,
Why don't you cheer up?
it's called the DDA.
The DDA?
Dumb Dumbs of America.
Oh.
Yeah, it costs $5,000 to join, and we never have any meetings. You don't get membership.
No membership?
Membership privileges, you don't even get a membership card.
Well, gee whiz, a person would have to be real dumb to join an organization like that.
Exactly. That's how we weed out all the undesirables. I said that's how we weed out all the undesirables.
You said that just the same as you did the first time. That ain't being too dumb. Well, doesn't your organization have any activities at all?
Yes, we went and did
You went and pulled what?
a dum-dum march, a dumb people's march on Washington.
Right.
Well, we got lost.
You got lost.
See, there's the look.
Is there any possible way that you can join an organization?
Yeah, like that. It's not It's an initiation test.
Oh,
And yeah, and you have to get under 30 to pass.
you have to have under 30 to pass? Well, what kind of test is it?
Well, let me show you. Could we have a dictionary, please?
It's another dummy that threw it in. All right, now how this thing find out. What do you do?
Well, you look in there, you pick out some words, and I'll tell you what they mean.
Oh, all right. All right. Okay,
None of
here
these
we
were
go.
right.
Appreciate.
Appreciate. That's like last year what you lost on your car.
Oh.
That's the
Posterity.
Posterity. That's what you're sitting on wherever you are.
Familiarize.
Familiarize. That's like when you're getting fresh with a chick-boom-boom.
Oh, all right. Subterfuge.
He goes in the game to kick.
What is in the game to kick?
Yeah, well.
Well, hot diggity dirt. I didn't know that.
So that's now that I've got your attention. Sorry. So today we're going to talk about Nietzsche's death of God argument. We haven't discussed that at all yet, right? We talked about Nietzsche at all. I think so. Yeah. Yes. So I should at least give you a glimpse of Nietzsche. Did we talk about his relationship to Hitler? No? Kind of? Yes? No? Maybe so? Y-E-Z-S-G. Fred. That mustache was on him when he was born. So that's a ticklish situation. Okay, so not a funny joke. Okay, I am just kidding. Usually babies are not born with mustaches. Or if they are, they fall off pretty fast. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. For many years in England and the United States, Nietzsche was not thought of as a philosopher. It wasn't until around the 1960s that it became kind of a fad, studying Nietzsche and existentialism in the University of Texas. So that's kind of interesting. So fortunately, that was the mid-60s, so by the time I was in college, 1969, 70, Nietzsche was clearly someone that you could read in philosophy curriculum, no problem, as well as the other existentialists. In fact, I had a course on existentialism. But there's a great video by the BBC.
We found a great match for you, but she comes with 2 siblings.
3 kids?
And once?
Aus einem Kind klein werden kann. Welche Sünden und welche Versuchungen eigentlich auf so einen jungen Menschen.
There has been a misunderstanding of the body. And his view was that our physical nature and our psychological nature has ultimate bearing on the way we think. And the phrase "the will to power," die Wille zur Macht in German,
Obviously,
I think can be read in terms of this idea of self-making.
See if I can just add. There she is. This is just a 4-minute segment. The whole thing takes about
In
50 minutes.
1850, Nietzsche, age 13, quiet but prodigiously academic, won a scholarship here to one of the most prestigious boarding schools in Germany. A former Cistercian abbey, Pforte would be the place that nourished many of Nietzsche's philosophical interests. Nietzsche believed that what he learned here formed him, both as a thinker and as a man.
Do we have any indication
indication of what kind of a student he was? Whether he was good, whether he was happy here?
Yes, we know, because we have his school report here. You see here?
That is brilliant. I never thought I'd seen Nietzsche's school report.
It is.
And there it is, Friedrich Wilhelm
Wait,
Nietzsche.
as long as
you see here the
digital
different topics
world remains stable and everything, I'm sure your record
this is
will be
interesting.
sitting there forever,
Because you would probably
including
not expect
all the
Nietzsche
pictures
to
you
be a
upload
brilliant
and
student in religion, but he obviously was,
what you
according
eat
to the
for
report
lunch,
here.
because
He was
you
excellent.
take an
He not
Instagram
only
of it, I
knew a lot
suppose.
about the main doctrines of Christianity, but he was also able to think and to write scholarly about these main doctrines.
So look up Bethany Hughes and Nietzsche and BBC. She's one of the BBC regulars. And you'll find that within like 50 minutes you'll learn an awful lot about Nietzsche that would take you hours reading books, right? Which we've discussed the conflict between reading versus visual media and so on. And plus, by going with Bethany Hughes on the tour, she takes you to the places where he was, the village in the Alps where he wrote Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the piece that we're looking at is from Thus Spake Zarathustra. This is Zarathustra coming down the hill and basically telling everyone that God is dead. We have killed him, etc. So, but as you watch, you see that Nietzsche grew up in a home with a Lutheran minister. Religion was a very important part for him. The tragedy occurs, though, when his father dies over many years, suffering from a miserable illness. Still, Nietzsche goes off to school to become a minister himself, basically to imitate what his father had done. But while there, he's reading philosophy and other things, and what we discover is sometimes when you're reading stuff to become a full-fledged minister, the stuff you read actually causes headache for you, and you end up losing your faith. It's kind of interesting. David Hume did the same kind of thing. When he was a young man, his family was Presbyterian. They all went to church. He was very religious, along with the rest of his family. And he goes reading books arguing for the existence of God, and in reading those books, and John Locke was one of them, he ends up having doubts. So it's kind of a famous situation that if you read Clarke's defense of God, you end up having doubts about whether God exists. So it seems like the novel, not the novelist, but the author Clarke, it was Clarke. I never read his works, but it sounds like his defense of God kind of stirs your mind to think just the opposite of what he intended to do. So that's kind of interesting. So Nietzsche ends up becoming a philosopher, a philologist actually, studying classics, the Greek especially, and ends up feeling one with the philosophy of his times. And if we look at his times, what were those? Well, we've got other individuals that are experiencing the same kind of thing that David Hume did. In fact, David Hume would be one of the ones that would inspire a lot of people. David Hume, in having his doubts, in a sense becoming enlightened, although we usually assign Kant the role of being the one who brings in the Enlightenment, because he even gives us an article that he wrote for a newspaper titled Was ist Erklärung? Oh, that didn't help, did it? Is this just in German? Oops. I thought I was going to get both, but so So Aufklärung, which literally I think means a clearing up. So in other words, deconfusing ourselves. But for some reason in English is translated as enlightenment. And who's enlightened? Well, we're enlightened because after Kant, we're literally able to step out of the human perception, realizing that, hey, that makes the world appear to us the way it does because we're human. So we're not actually able to see what the world is like outside of the way humans perceive things. And that ability to be transcendental, to transcend that limitation by at least knowing that we're limited by our perspective, right? Enables us to transcend the mere phenomena and know what must be the case in order for us to have that kind of perception. So that's transcending it, and being able to do that gives us enlightenment, right? We've now been cleared up. We're not confused by the way things are perceived by human beings, because we realize that's the way human beings see it. And by the way, of course, culture becomes the way that is established, and since there are different cultures, we of course today realize that people living in different cultures, different languages, are going to perceive things differently than people in another culture, etc., right? But we can step back from the limitations culture imposes on us and logically figure out what must be the case in order for those experiences, those cultures, to operate that way. So that's essentially where that takes us today. But part of all of that, David Hume is critical of God. Some people say he was absolutely an atheist. Others argue that he was really more of an agnostic. He just was very critical of the arguments for the existence of God. So that's a possibility. Kant, on the other hand, as I think I showed, argued that morality is absolute. We have, that's, of course, not everyone will agree with Kant, but Kant felt that morality was absolute, and it only makes sense provided that there is a God, because otherwise morality doesn't make sense. Without a God, there is, everything is permitted. You know, there's no lawgiver, there's no restrictions, right? So, you know, for Kant, there must be a God, because we have an intuitive sense of morality. By the way, once things opened up and it became culture that enabled us to structure how we perceive the world, since there are different cultures, you don't have a universal morality, and of course that leads us into more of a problem of relativity in morality, which if you take that deep dive and say, oh, everything is relative, so nothing is permitted. Whoa. Or everything is permitted, right? Or nothing, you know, depending on your point of view. In other words, anything goes, if you take that relative point of view. But that's wrong. Don't take the deep dive. Recognize that just because there are relative points of view, there are truths within each of them. There are complex systems where you literally have to accept the axioms of that system. And those axioms have to be true in that system for you to play the game in that system, right? There are rules to football, right? You know, there are rules to love and death. You know, there's all sorts of rules out there, and so we can say that there are truths, but keep in mind that truth is linguistic and contextual. At least that's our current enlightened point of view. When we're looking back at the human experience and we say, why is it that humans think there are things that are true? That's because we speak a language and we want to trust one another. And by the way, you know, we used to think that all sorts of things were true, but we narrowed that because of science. And now feel like, well, but the only things that could be true are things that are mapped on linguistically to the actual state of affairs, right? So if it doesn't actually map the state of affairs, then it can't be tested, can't be verified by other people, right? Well, if that's the case, then a lot of things that are your opinion, of course. Your opinion is that, that's perfectly fine wearing a short sleeve shirt in 20-degree weather. Other people are still in their jackets, right? You're not going to complain about what he's wearing, and he's not going to complain, because it's your own opinion of what's comfortable, etc. And we're different. But there's still truths associated with that. Because if you suddenly start to sweat and get too hot, you're right to say, I'm too hot. That's true, right? Right? So in a way, it makes truth much more complex. But nonetheless, that's a more powerful tool to recognize how that works. Okay, so Kant argues that there must be a God. Hume, agnostic at least, right? Maybe an atheist. But after Kant, then you have Fichte, Gottlob Fichte, who basically leads us away from Kant's very abstract conception of reason towards the physical and culture and language. And then that leads to Hegel and his group. Herder was another one. Herder was a Lutheran minister, but was very interested in language and how language worked. So if you look up Herder, he's earlier than Hegel. By quite a few years. Poet, theologian, literary critic, associated with periods of enlightenment. Sturm und Drang. Have you ever heard of that? Sturm und Drang is literally, storm, obviously. Drang is like drama, I suppose. Let's pull it up. Storm and stress. Okay. So it's kind of the romantic period. This romantic in the sense not of people falling in love with one another, although that is concurrent with that, by the way. But at the same time, it's more a matter of meaning in life needs to be emotional and powerful. And by the way, if it's not, it's very depressing, and people decide to shoot themselves in the head. It's kind of interesting. One of the more popular novels of the day, in fact, it was the first bestseller ever, and that's Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. The reason he's sorrowful, he's an educated young man, not a priest or anything, gets his education, wants to go off and be a teacher, falls in love with a married woman. That becomes the powerful meaning of his life is falling in love with this woman. But she's happily married, not interested in him, and as a result, he's incredibly depressed and shoots himself. Sorry about the sound effect. But it was an old gun, so back then, you had to go. Yeah, it's not like you just go, that's terrible. Let me get off of that. My sense of humor must be awful. Sorry. I suppose everybody that gets an education, right? When we asked John Stuart Mill's fill in the blank, better to be a dissatisfied human than a happy pig, better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a happy fool, right? And so what do we mean by that? Well, does it mean you really should have voted for Hillary? I mean, that's wrong. You know? What the heck are we talking about? You know, actually, if we bring up voting and remind everyone that tomorrow we get to vote, if hopefully you're registered. I remember this is like your first time voting. I don't know. Any of you voting for the first time tomorrow? You'll always remember it. It's kind of neat. Let's see if this happens.
Ann Coulter, welcome to Scandinavia.
Thank you.
Actually, I know we're in Manhattan, but this is Scandinavia in Manhattan.
I can tell because the audience is so attractive.
Oh yeah, and I guess you can smell all the liberals as well. So it's
yes, but as
smell
long as
all
they're
the
good
liberals.
looking, who cares?
Tell me, why do you think it's so hard for this show? Because we really tried hard to find someone that can explain Trump as a phenomenon from the other side, from the right side. And it's been very hard for a Scandinavian show in New York to get someone on.
It's very hard to find someone in America who can explain Donald Trump to you. I'm not surprised there is confusion. I think it's because most of Trump's supporters aren't people like me who go on TV. They're out in America. They're roofers and farmers and gas station attendants and they're doctors. I mean, there are a lot of New Yorkers who love him, but wow, not the commentary class, not the people who go on TV.
When did you realize that Donald Trump was your guy?
If we're in the laboratory designing my ideal presidential candidate, I don't think in a million years I would have come up with Donald Trump, but I give a lot of speeches in America. That's mostly what I do. I write. I mean, everything else I do free. The only ways I make money is by writing books and giving speeches. And I noticed, oh my gosh, immigration is a big issue.
Your books
and
are pretty
in
much
Washington,
repeats,
DC,
so after
they
2 or
do
3,
not
I stopped
care.
buying
They
them.
absolutely will not listen to the voters. It was all about immigration. So when Trump came down the escalator and gave what I fondly refer to as the Mexican rapist speech, he had just read my book, Adios America.
So this was,
they would read
in a way, it was inspired by you.
Much of it, I mean, is the footnotes to, he had the right instincts. He definitely had the right instincts, but there was the book. And he saw me, actually before the book came out, talking about it with Jorge Ramos and asked for an advance copy of it. He has a sense for what the public wants.
How well do you know him?
Well, not very well. I mean, I grew up in Connecticut. So Trump was just always something that was there. He was like the Empire State Building.
But do you know him personally?
I've met him. He was never really, he's not a very Connecticut type person. We kind of look down on people who brag about their wealth. So he wasn't exactly, you know, in terms of style, my cup of tea. But I overcame that because he's giving me the issues I care about. And then there comes a moment, I mean, I advised him a little bit during the campaign. I showed up at Mar-a-Lago one night.
This is funny.
It was after you, I hope you don't know about this, but there was a moment during one of the debates when he was, not obviously, but obviously, bragging about his penis size. So I showed up at Mar-a-Lago. It's just him, Hope Hicks, Corey Lewandowski. The whole campaign was 3 people, those 3 people. I show up, they're eating dinner, they're exhausted, and I said to him, look, I'm the only person losing money trying to put you in the White House. You're going to listen to me. No more bragging about your penis size. And he said...
Just to have that problem with a candidate.
It was very unusual. Yes, I admit that.
Let's face it, on the other side of politics, that also
So, just as an example, if you haven't seen her before, she's brilliant, by the way, and actually a Trump supporter, etc. So she's an example of the brilliant kind of folks that are supporting what's going on. There are other ones, for example, Hanson? Is it Hanson? I thought it was Hanson.
Of your community, are we better educated this year than last year? Are we making buildings that are beautiful, functional buildings? Do we have good roads? Are we leaving our children a dam and an aqueduct system better than what we inherited? We never ask those questions. And so we look at, the world looks at us and they sort of think, wow, this generation was given a great inheritance. And I think this may be the one that doesn't pass on something as well to its children.
So he's another, so there are, it's kind of interesting to see how the educated disagree with one another, even though they're all educated. So that just because you're educated doesn't mean you're in one camp, right? Does that make sense? And by the way, I hope to try to learn enough about both camps that I can remain neutral. You know? I'm just telling you, hey, this is interesting, look at these, but not taking sides. Kind of interesting. Pardon?
Being independent.
Well, I feel like if you take sides, you lose that enlightenment point of view. Because if you're, say, following Kant, you're both basically looking at all of the things that people do, and you're not going to take sides with like one group over another one, because what you're really doing is taking sides with the group of people that don't take sides, which a lot of people don't like. They feel like you ought to be on one side or another. It is still a side, but it's a meta side, right? So if we think of it that way, that's kind of intriguing. The bad thing is, here comes the comet that's going to destroy the Earth, and you're saying, oh, this is interesting. Sorry, but okay. So Kant is for God. Feuerbach. Let me mention Feuerbach. I didn't. Feuerbach is the next one that I ought to mention. Feuerbach influences Marx, but Feuerbach. I forget if we mentioned him already or not. I think I was talking about Fichte, but Feuerbach, that's an easy name to remember because Feuer means fire and Bach is a stream. So basically, he's a stream on fire. Usually doesn't happen unless you're in Pennsylvania in the 60s. Pollution. Sorry. Silent Spring. You familiar with that? Silent Spring. That was very famous. Silent Spring. It's like the first, as far as I know, first environmental book that pointed out that we're polluting our Earth with all these modern pollutants that we're not paying attention to, and we're basically killing people. And by the way, Rachel Carson herself died of cancer. It's kind of interesting too.
What type of cancer?
Not offhand.
It's okay.
But you can look up Rachel Carson pretty easily. I'm trying to learn that with modern technology, you should never have a question in your head longer than 2 seconds without knowing the answer.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So she's really quite famous. My wife loves her, has all her books. So if you're ever interested in talking about Rachel Carson, call up my wife.
So, talk about heart attack.
It says a heart attack, but did she have cancer? Well,
I don't know. It's a cover-up.
so you're faster than I am.
We confirmed breast cancer, and her treatment regimen. Carson became ill with respiratory virus, and in January of 1964, her condition worsened, and in February, doctors found she had severe anemia from her radiation treatments, and in March, they discovered that the cancer had reached her liver. So,
Bad news. Well, what I remembered was that here she is out doing all these actual physical investigations of places where all these poisons are, and lo and behold, she ends up dying of cancer herself, while arguing that cancer is like bad for you. I mean, well, that these poisons are bad for you and can cause cancer. So it's like one of those examples, like not exactly like Madame Curie. You know, what's that little blue light? It's killing you. Don't look at it. By the way, her tomb, Madame Curie's tomb in Paris, is actually still radioactive. Her body is still. So if you're in Paris, don't visit her tomb. It's like, that would be dumb. You know, why would you go
Do they
visit
have it, like,
a radioactive?
They have it like roped off.
No. I mean, it was safe for me because I was, of course, just wearing my Oculus Rift, you know. So I can go in and I can say, oh, there's her tomb, there's her husband, right? You know, they were both, which is where we get Curies as the measurement of radioactivity, right? So, okay, so for Feuerbach. So Feuerbach is a slightly older individual that influences Karl Marx. But Feuerbach is the one that gives us humanism in the sense that many, especially religious people, feel humanists are bad people because they're anti-religion. Actually, for Feuerbach, he thought religion should be humanism. And he's definitely against God. He feels that by creating these traditional narratives about God, that God is absolutely divine, perfect, and everything else, makes human beings, the sad sacks, the miserable sinners, you know, our life is absolutely horrible. We should feel guilty, and etc. Right? You know, so the reason that we feel so badly about our human predicament is because we've held the divine, which we've invented. So he gives us a great line. Instead of God creating man in his own image, pull up, you know, God in the Sistine Chapel pointing the finger at Adam. You know how, right? Yes. By the way, I love the play on that in Lucy. Not Lucy. Lucy, though, is remember the...
I love Lucy.
No. Sorry.
I love that show.
It's
the movie.
It's the one where the woman ends up ingesting that blue stuff and becoming a super mental. What the heck was that movie?
Avatar?
No, I think you're right. I think it's Lucy.
Is it Lucy?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
It is Lucy.
The one that could use all of her brain almost.
With,
Right.
isn't that Scarlett Johansson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very true. Creating Lucy. Maybe I can find that. What do you think?
Yeah, isn't that where you can use like 99% of your brain
Yeah.
instead of 10?
actually seeing the creation of the world.
Oh,
Sorry. You were excited there for a minute. Oh, we get to actually have a front row seat on the actual creation of the world. It's called CGI, computer graphics. Music, by the way, I guarantee when this actually happened, there was no music. Do you see an orchestra anywhere out in space all sitting there?
They're behind the camera.
No. Okay, here it is. There it is. They skipped the part, though, where she's sitting in the chair. It's a little bit more interesting than that. Oh, well. Feuerbach gives us the expression, man created God in his own image. Flips the whole process, right? So instead of God creating man, we've got man creating God. But how do we create God? Not actually by creating a real God. Instead, we create a story, a narrative. And, by the way, how does this narrative go? If we look at, say, a contemporary, this is pretty cool. This is God the Editor. God in the Quran. Notice that Jack Miles has written God in the Quran, Christ, a crisis in the life of God, and God, a biography. And God, a biography, he won a Pulitzer Prize for in 1996. And what he basically argues is that God, if you take the scripture and you follow God along, as God evolves, God has a biography, so God matures as you go through it, right? And so you can see God starting off basically as a primitive, imaginary. A lot of scholars refer to the early gods as fantasy gods, like mostly the Hindu gods. There's thousands of them. But the pagan gods, the Zeus and Wotan and things of that sort, they all have basic characteristics of the God story. So just like philosophy, as we touch on, the historical philosophers, and they come up with things like Stoicism. Well, you could still be a Stoic today. The lessons we get from those philosophers continue with us. So just because we go back into history and say, Epictetus gave us these kinds of ideas, Augustine gave us these kind, etc. Those are old, those are passé in a lot of ways, but a lot of the central points remain with us and are part of, like the oak tree. Where did the acorn go? Well, it, in a sense, is still there in the oak tree, right? So those ideas are still with us. What kinds of things do they go through? Well, for one thing, if all three religions of the book, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are religions of the book, right? And that's why do we call them that? Anybody offhand? Old Testament, New Testament, and Quran, right? So they have a book, right? Any other religions have a book? Founding book? Mormonism. But that's also a Christian. So that's good. So they've got some extra books. They still use the Bible.
Seems like Eastern traditions have a lot of books. I can't think of
Who?
one. Eastern tradition, like
Eastern traditions?
religion, they'll have many books instead of just like one main one.
But that seems to be the traditional way of referring to the three monotheistic religions as the religions of the book. It's kind of interesting. But if they are all talking about one God, don't they all have to be talking about the same God? We agree on that? Different interpretations of the same God? So one argument is that Islam is the most modern version, the most updated, so to speak, religion, because in Islam they argue, now this is kind of interesting, that Jesus is a prophet. So Jesus is an important prophet in the Islamic tradition, but they don't think of him as God. And by the way, that seems to be at least partially explained by Muhammad growing up in a village that had a Jewish community who were Jesus Christians. So they were Christian, but Jewish, but the difference was they believed that Jesus was a prophet like Moses and others. So they were Jewish, but treated Jesus as a prophet, not as God, right? And Muhammad grew up in that village and basically learned about Jesus through that tradition, right? And so, by the way, in Islam, Jesus is a prophet, not God. And by the way, Muhammad is a prophet as well, right? But he's the last prophet, as far as they're concerned. Of course, if you're Church of Latter-day, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you have to. One of my favorite, interesting ones was the Swedenborgian one. Did I show you the church, Swedenborgian church? Did I? Yes. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so if you follow Islam, their argument is there is the most updated, newest, best interpretation of who God is. And God in the Quran denies that Jesus is God, denies that there's others, there's only one. No God but God is one of the phrases, right? Right? So that's, and in fact there's interesting books out there on that same topic by Reza Aslan. And it's kind of interesting, Aslan has the same name as the lion and the witch in the wardrobe. So that's kind of cool. By the way, he's absolutely fascinating too. No God but God. This is
making room for everyone makes life rich. Ritz.
Defenders of Islam insist it is a peaceful religion. Others disagree and point to the primitive treatment in Muslim countries of women and other minorities.
So let's discuss this now. We're joined now by Reza Aslan, a scholar of religions, professor at the University of California, Riverside, and the author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's talk about this because it's a very interesting conversation every time we have it. Before we get into the discussion, I want to play for you this clip from Bill Maher's show just this Friday night.
President Obama keeps insisting that ISIS is not Islamic. Well, maybe they don't practice the Muslim faith the same way he does. But if vast numbers of Muslims across the world believe, and they do, that humans deserve to die for merely holding a different idea, or drawing a cartoon, or writing a book, or eloping with the wrong person, not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS. There's so much talk. You can applaud.
He went on for a good 5 or 6 minutes about that, talking about how women, circumcision for women, not respecting the rights of women, not respecting the rights.
Opinion, this is an.
So this is a different interview.
But I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing. religion, including the New Testament. Just some Muslim writing about Jesus. I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. But I've been obsessed with Jesus.
It still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually. So, I mean, it would be like asking a Christian why they would write a book about, Islam. I'm not sure about that. But honestly, I've been obsessed with Jesus for really 20 years. I've been studying his life and his work and the origins of Christianity, both in an academic environment and at a personal level for about 2 decades. And just to be clear, this is not some attack on Christianity. My mother is a Christian. My wife is a Christian. My brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor. Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.
I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing.
She continues to be an idiot. So that's that's why this is.
She should go trying that
kind of famous. By the way, it's a pretty good book, actually. Zealot, however you say it. Okay, so if we're thinking about ways of looking at God from this kind of Feuerbachian point of view, if we treat God as a narrative, and that it's a narrative that basically has been evolving, and so you could trace it through the various religions of the book. And of course you could trace it even earlier, because it's actually still important to the archaeology, so to speak, of God and God ideas to go back before there was just one God. Right? I love the opera on Akhenaten, however you. I showed you that a little bit, right, by Philip Glass. You ever played that at all? The trouble is when my mind starts to go, I can't remember what I should remember as opposed to what I haven't remembered.
This holiday season, find great gifts for the musician in your life. Get an Elisa's electronic drum set.
This YouTube clip is not a video of the actual opera being performed, but just the music. By the way, it's in Egyptian, ancient Egyptian. That's pretty cool. Not that anybody could follow it, because all the ancient Egyptians are dead, but nonetheless. This is Akhenaten here. Don't be surprised, he is a counter-tenor. Very high tenor in voice. This is an opera. Notice Akhenaten is a historical figure. Nefertiti was his wife. King Tutankhamun was his son. first monotheist, tried to get rid of the other gods, and the priesthood class killed him, replaced them with Tutankhamun, who was a puppet to their wishes to restore the multiple gods, the polytheistic religions of Egypt. Exciting. He goes up the steps.
Does he fall back down?
He does not. The most exciting part is the sun comes out. Wait till you see it. I'm pretty sure the Pharaoh was actually bald. They always put those hats on. Explanation of why he thought the sun was so much higher a god than all the... They thought of the other gods as all frivolous. Here it comes. Just watch, it's very exciting. There will be rays. Sun rays. Here you go. Get a new countertenor, but I bet those are hard to find. See, here come the rays. Notice they're all hands.
Oh.
Those are special effects. Oh, his hands lit up. There are singing techniques you learn that enable you to sing while you're inhaling. You don't have to just sing while you're exhaling. You can sing while you're inhaling as well. idea for the special effects in the opera are actually from Akhenaten's the way he was misshapen. Never explained why, but he had some kind of a display, by the way, is in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Art and Archaeology in Philadelphia. Did I show you that already? I took that with this camera. Pretty neat. There's a book titled Moses the Egyptian. I didn't spell it right. How can you misspell Moses? I did spell it right. Moses the Egyptian. The memory of Egypt and Western monotheism. So, this is a Freudian point of view and argues that Moses, being, even from the story, was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter, right? He was a basket case. That's a joke too. Everybody got that? It's a basket case. Sorry. It's not my joke, I'm just, you know. In any case, the argument is that he's the one, of course, that led the Hebrews, and Hebrews is Egyptian for slaves, so he led the slaves out of Egypt. And the argument in the book is that he was a follower of Akhenaten, maybe even Akhenaten's high priest for his monotheistic religion. And when the other priests killed Akhenaten, Moses fled. And so the monotheists fled to northern Egypt, which, of course, became Israel, essentially. Right? All that kind of, you get the idea. So when we look at all of this wealth of books about and arguments about the nature of God, what we're looking at is really a idea that these narratives evolve, and that, in a sense, the concepts of God become more and more powerful. Of course, when we think about Anselm and we do the ontological argument, we get that modern definition. 1100, is that modern? Becomes the modern definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. God becomes untouchable, unknowable, whatever, you know, because that definition doesn't allow us to do anything else with that concept. But at the same time, if you like the argument, you're convinced that that demonstrates that God exists. However, for Feuerbach, all of these stories are essentially man-made. There is no God, which, by the way, that argument doesn't work either. You can't prove that something doesn't exist. It's kind of, you know, I know everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people love the flying spaghetti, right, argument, you know, especially if you are a pastafarian. Yes? That's a yeah, if you hadn't heard that before, that's a joke on the Rastafarians. That was a real religion, but they call themselves pastafarians because they believe, you know, that God with the two meatballs, you know, the flying spaghetti monster. Not seen it? Flying spaghetti monster. That's just wrong. But So Nietzsche, in coming along and arguing that God is dead, is not arguing, we have killed God. That's a quote, actually. And what it's arguing, and he's actually quoting Martin Luther. Remember, he was, for a while, studying to be a Lutheran minister. And so the tradition is that we have killed God because of our sinfulness. God, in this story, which we can see it in this one, Christ, a crisis in the life of God, right? It's a reading of God's continuing biography. And in this one, God realizes he has screwed up. And remember, he actually created stuff, didn't like it, so destroyed it, wiped everyone out. Once Noah started cooking meat, and he said, oh wow, that smell of grilled meat's terrific. And so he decided never to kill off humanity ever again. Put the rainbow in the sky, as a promise, right? All that sort of thing. But ends up sending. So this is this author here, right? But you can interpret that as kind of a trend in Christianity, that God basically, of course, sacrifices his own son. In many ways, the same as Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and or depends on which interpretation you have of which son he took up to the mountain, right? The Arabic tradition believes that it was the progenitor of the Arabs, whereas the Jewish tradition believes it was Isaac, right? Is that right? Did I get that right? Ishmael is the other one, right? Yes? Did I tell you about that? That's kind of an important little difference, because that explains Palestine and Israel. So Abraham takes his only son up the mountain, but what was the first son he had? Ishmael. So the Elohim come to his camp in the desert, and they have a good time. He gives them a great meal. They promise him that his son will inherit all this land. But the trouble is, Abraham doesn't have a son yet, and his wife, Sarai, or Sarah, is barren, right? She hasn't had any children, and in fact, she's now postmenopausal. So when they promise him that his son will inherit all this land, Sarai famously laughs at God because she's postmenopausal. But Abraham takes them at their word, and he wants to have a son, and so Sarah gives him her maid, Hagar, in order to have a child with her. And she becomes pregnant, and she eventually gives birth to Ishmael, right, which means God hears him, right? Ishmael. El is God, right? Elohim, right? That causes problems for Sarah, because now she's not best wife. How can her slave girl be essentially the best wife? Everyone treats her with respect because she's the mother of the heir. So Sarah says she has to go. So Abraham takes her and Ishmael off into the desert and leaves them there, where God says to leave them. So there's versions of that, though. In any case, Sarah does become pregnant. It's a miracle, right? And she gives birth to Isaac. But notice that because of that story, that obviously means Ishmael is the first son. So when God tells Abraham to take his only son up the mountain, the Arabs argue that had to be Ishmael. See? Whereas the Jews argue that it had to be Isaac, because Isaac was the only legitimate son. Exactly. So basically, you can see that it's that conflict in the story that's still at the root of the controversy, because both sides say that God promised us this land, right? You see that they're fighting over a story that, guess what? Unless we get a time machine and get to go back and find out which kid it was, we're not going to be able to solve that dilemma, right? It's not my fault. This would be evil. This would be an evil question. But I'll ask it, of course. How to phrase it. So the question I want to ask you is, who do you think God promised Israel to? That prejudices the outcome, doesn't it? Who do you think God promised the land that the Palestinians and the Israelis fight over? Please send that to me. That would be, I would have saved that one. Is that a good question? But Nietzsche argues God is dead. We have killed him. He's talking about the narrative, not that we've actually killed God. He's talking about all these versions of the story. We've done away with those. We no longer need them. Instead, you are gods. All of you are gods. And you have to create your own morality. So that's, I guess, it for today. Good quiz question? Except for one person, that means you have to look up stuff, right? Otherwise,
yeah.
Unless you all agree that God promised the land to the dinosaurs. The terrible lizards. Why do we say dinosaurs? Terrible lizard is the English translation. Right. Oh, what was the question?
It was something about Haman.
Oh, what's the problem with the homunculus?
Homunculus.
Like the theory.
Yes. What's the main problem with the homunculus?
Homunculus.
I just posted on my blog.
Yeah.
Homunculus.
Is there any way you can email me my standing grade in this class?
It's an A.
Oh, okay. That works for me.
I put the A in the
But that's
midterm grade.
midterm. That's not outterm.
Well, it's also your sitting grade.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
Could be your lying grade. I don't know. Whatever position you're in.
Don't tell the
Depends. Mr. Jameson, are you teaching an ethics class here next semester?
I incorporate ethics in my philosophy class, but the 301 course?
Yeah.
No, I don't do that.
Do you teach at the main campus? Or do you just...
I used to, but the only course I do there now is the summer online course.
Okay. But you're not going to teach them here? An ethics class? You're not going to teach an ethics class?
No, I just do the 201, 101, 211, and 212.
Thank you.
Unless you ask them, convince them.
I can.
Yeah, get
all 6 people. I'll get all my friends.